Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
Hey folks, Tom Opre here with the Shepherds.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.
Hey folks, we've got Andy Wightman here today as our guest. And Andy, we spoke a little bit before we started rolling the cameras. When it comes to wildlife conservation, what are the greatest issues when it comes to the red deer and the red grouse here in Scotland?
Well, I think first of all, in common with the rest of the planet, the biggest issue facing us is climate change, and we're seeing quite profound shifts in behaviour in many wildlife populations. So that's a challenge facing, everybody. But specifically in terms of wildlife in Scotland, we are in the midst of a bit of a biodiversity crisis, a nature crisis. We're a country that is traditionally thought to be rich in nature, but actually many of our wildlife populations are suffering. We're also a very deforested country, quite a degraded country. Industrial agriculture, industrial forestry have depleted ecosystems, have simplified ecosystems, and destroyed much of the rich habitat that we once had, and that's on land and at sea in terms of industrial fishing. And again, those are problems I think that are pretty universal across the world. So the big challenge really is to manage our wildlife resources, our wider habitat resource in a sustainable way, and resolve many of the big conflicts there are over how that management takes place and who makes the decisions. So it's basically a political problem. And again, that's the same around the world. So nothing special here in some senses.
Andy, let's talk about the deer. What is the history of the deer? Where have they been? Where they are today? And kind of what does the future hold when it comes to these ecosystems?
So historically here in the Highlands, the deer, which is our largest land mammal, deer and salmon and all wildlife are still today public. They are feri naturi in law. They don't belong to anybody. And prior to the coming of the big sporting estates, prior to the 19th century, these resources were managed by local people. Basically, in quite an old Gaelic tradition, there were rules governing how much wood you could take from the wood, how many salmon you could take from the river, how many deer you could take from the hill. And populations lived by and large in harmony with nature. I think it's overstated how much that harmony was. There was quite a bit of conflict, but nevertheless, these were managed as common pool resources. And then you had the British Industrial Revolution. You had vast amounts of capital, excess capital in the north of England in particular. You had the coming of the railways here in the Highlands, the development of the breech-loading rifle. You had Queen Victoria buying a Highland estate and making it fashionable to own land in the Highlands and to have it as a playground, a place to come and have a holiday and hunt. And suddenly millions of acres were transformed into hunting reserves. And then deer became not the property of the landlord, but they became a management issue for the landowner. And laws were passed, the game laws, that prohibited people from killing deer and other species. So that was a huge transition. And for the hunting economy, traditionally speaking, they have wanted large numbers of their quarry species. And that has been easy to engineer. There are no natural predators for deer. We don't have wolves or lynx anymore, so humans are their only predator. But the downside is maintaining high populations of a very large herbivore has had damaging impacts on the ecosystem. So typically on the regeneration of woodland, there's been high grazing pressure, leading not just to plant degradation in plant communities, but also degradation to soils and erosion. And so the big challenge in deer management today, and remember, deer are a woodland animal. They're not meant to live in the open hill. and give them a wood, they'll head into the wood. That's where they want to live. So the big challenge today is to get numbers down to more sustainable levels so that plant communities and other wildlife communities can flourish, but also to get them back into their native habitat, which is woodland. And the difficulty there is that if you have too many deer in woodland, they'll destroy the woodland itself. So you have to get the numbers down, and you have to manage them. These are wild animals, they're roaming quite large areas. You have to manage them on a large scale as well. So in a sense, it's one of our more profound wildlife management challenges, because there are competing interests between hunting interests, environmental interests, about numbers, culling levels, governance of this very iconic Scottish animal.
You mentioned this iconic creature. What does the red deer or the red stag mean to the people of Scotland?
Well, what red deer represent culturally now is very much a product of the 19th century and the coming of the sporting estate, because with the coming of the sporting estate came popular illustration and images of this new lifestyle. And these were wealthy people who acted as patrons to the arts. And so you had artists like Landseer, who painted the famous Monarch of the Glen. And the deer became this symbol of what the landed class at that time regarded as a great untamed wilderness. Now, it was not an untamed wilderness. This is a land that many, many people used to live in. They had rights to hunt the deer themselves. This is a land transformed into these large hunting reserves. But our cultural view of red deer now is a mixture of that Victorian image of the quarry animal, the proud quarry animal, the symbol of how the Highlands was being portrayed. And it is also a symbol of our broader wildlife. It's valued just because it is part of our native wildlife. And the people who value it for those reasons and don't see it necessarily associated with some sort of grandeur or status or whatever that, their concerns are about how this animal is being managed, not just for the sake of the wider environment, but also for the sake of itself. And actually, a lot of people who encounter red deer for the first time in their lives are encountering animals that are low down in the autumn or the spring or in the winter itself, that are quite emaciated, and they don't look terribly grand. And the reason they don't look terribly grand is they're about half the body weight they should be, because they're living in a very harsh climate. So yes, a lot of mixture of emotions I think about red deer. They're the convergence of a lot of conflict about how to manage nature, how to manage wild animals. But they are also a symbol of what the Highlands means, what nature means to people more broadly.
Yeah, Andy, that sounds like a great answer. Sticking with the red deer here, there's been these forestry schemes that have started back in, World War I, World War II, then again back, I think, in the 70s and 80s, early 90s. Of course, that affects the management of red deer. We have this global warming crisis, or climate change, depending on what you want to, who you want to talk to, who you want to believe in. You've got the scenario where you've got lots of landowners that we're trying to do with, say, land reform. Really, how are we going to manage red deer in Scotland so that we're going to have healthy populations of red deer in perpetuity?
Well, it's not actually a problem to manage red deer. It's a question of deciding why you're managing them, what you want out of that. And at the moment, we're still in a period where we're trying to mitigate the negative impacts of high numbers. We're still in that phase, and I think we're going to be in that phase for some time. The solutions to that are to do heavier culling. That is happening in many areas, and woodlands are recovering. It's not happening in other areas where landowners wish still to have relatively high numbers to hunt. But even amongst that community, they're beginning to appreciate that even lower densities of bigger animals are still a fantastic hunting opportunity that can also bring additional benefits as well. So we're in a position now where we are reappraising how we manage an animal that has historically been managed purely as a quarry species, and the regulation of which has been managed by a government agency, for example, the Red Deer Commission, that was set up to govern what kind of rifles you use, when in the year you could shoot them, welfare issues and all that kind of stuff. We've moved on from looking at it purely as a quarry species that needs regulated to an animal that sits in a wider ecosystem that needs restored. And how do we restore that balance? And we're on that journey. We're also dealing with some parts of the deer population that are not red deer, not the native red deer, but are imported deer from the south or from continental Europe. We're dealing with a lot of deer in lowland environments that are growing very, very fast, where it's actually very difficult to cull these animals because they're in and around urban areas, they're in and around farms, there's people around. They're not on a big, open, virtually empty highland estate where it's relatively straightforward to cull them. So we're facing a number of challenges. Also, traffic. With deer densities, we're now getting regularly high levels of collision on roads, which is also not good for the deer. It's also not good for the vehicles that come into collision with it, and some people are injured as a consequence. So we're now in a phase where we're seeing how we manage red deer, not as just an environmental issue, not just as an issue to do with a quarry species, but as a component of a wider ecosystem. And that's a positive development.
You know, in talking to people around Scotland, we hear that deer, I guess the best word is kind of the bad actor. There's kind of this perception around them as maybe being negative in certain segments of the population here. I mean, you've got this scenario of, deer are woody browsers during certain times of the year. And of course, they browse on trees, especially young growth. But in this age of rewilding that seems to be all the rage right now, are deer really the bad actors in this play?
Well, any herbivore is going to eat plants, is going to eat young trees. I don't like blaming animals. It's us that choose how to manage these populations. And because we don't have apex predators anymore that are exercising that function, it is down to us to decide what to do. And so these are about choices. And half the time we're not making the choices, we're just ignoring the issues and letting things happen. But we need to make active choices. Deer, I would say, are a better animal, if you like, environmentally speaking, than sheep. Sheep are very selective grazers. They compact the ground. Their feces don't break down successfully. And if you look at the history of the Highlands, sheep didn't feature in large numbers. They're a product of the post-clearance era, when huge areas of land were turned over to sheep ranching. What people typically had were cattle. Cattle are a much more benign domestic animal. They're good for the environment, broadly speaking. And the Highlander had cattle. Cattle were high value. They responded to intensive husbandry. And they were driven south on big journeys to the markets down in the centre of Scotland. We need more cattle on the hill, I would say. They're very helpful, actually, in woodland regeneration because they break up the soil. So all of these animals, domestic and wild, have their own particular place in the story about woodland regeneration. The bottom line is, if we want woodlands and forests to regenerate naturally, and they will do, they are enthusiastic to do, the minute you put up a fence and exclude grazing of any type, whoomph, it all comes back. The critical thing is to manage that grazing pressure, and there's different ways of doing that. You can move animals, you can get the densities down, you can have different densities in different places, but you need to have a plan. You need to have a management plan that's designed to achieve the outcomes you want. What are those outcomes? Those are still contested because you have different people owning different bits of land and they have different priorities. So it is a job for the public sector, for government agencies, really, to sit down and try and work out a plan for the future. And I think most people now agree that we need to restore nature, we need to restore biodiversity, we need to restore, above all, our soils, we need to restore our naturally flowing rivers, our forests, we need to stop our peatlands degrading. These are all things that are in and of themselves good things to do and should be done anyway, but are now being given added focus because of climate change. So I think that is the consensus now. Everyone basically agrees we need to restore ecosystems. And if you restore ecosystems, alongside ecosystems go these component parts, these animal populations. And increasingly what I see is that hunting interests, for example, in 50 years' time, hunting interests will be interests that sit alongside other interests. People go hunting in the woods for deer, or they go hunting in scrubby areas for grouse, or they go fishing in rivers that are now healthy and full of salmon and trout. So we will continue to have hunting. The difference between 50 years' time and now in the past is we will lose this sense of large areas of land being managed pretty exclusively for one purpose, whether it's industrial cellulose, whether it's red deer hunting, whether it's intensive agriculture. We need to move away from that because all of these land uses have had damaging impacts on soils and biodiversity.
Yeah, Andy, that's a great answer. Let's pivot here to red grouse, the native bird here in Scotland. You went up to Edinglassie, part of the Dunnock Estates, and we've been able to document what they do to manage the land, in order to enhance the habitat for the red grouse, and also obviously the predation issues they have with red grouse. Really, what is the outcome? I mean, what do you think they're doing, and how does that work in things, as far as the overall scheme of management of the land?
So with the coming of the sporting estate, which was the latter part of the 19th century, and you typically had wealthy industrialists that made their money in empire, and they would come and they wouldn't buy large areas of the Highlands, they would lease large areas of the Highlands from the indigenous Highland aristocracy, who were relatively poor. They were not wealthy by any manner of means. You don't get wealthy managing uplands in the Highlands historically. So the Highland aristocracy would lease large areas of land out to these wealthy industrialists on typically improving leases. And these improving leases meant that the new tenant, who maybe had 25 or 30 years sporting tenancy, would build or restore a big house or castle. They would build roads, they would put fences in, they would drain, they would do all these so-called improvements. And at the end of the lease, because it was an improving lease, the landlord, if they wanted the land back, would have to compensate the tenant for these improvements. Now, no Highland landowner could really compensate a wealthy Lancashire industrialist for the kind of so-called improvements they made. And so then they bottom out and they became owners. And the sporting interests were typically threefold: fish, salmon, principally also trout, red deer, and grouse. The grouse interest was mainly in the eastern part of the country, where you had drier conditions, which is favoured by grouse and favoured by heather. And they developed a system of shooting grouse that was unlike anything else in continental Europe, which was typically focused on small parties of people with dogs walking through upland environments, which were typically shrubby, low forest, open ground. They would flush birds of whatever species and they would shoot them, and they would go back with 10 birds. We developed a system of driven grouse shooting, whereby you would have a line of people walking across a hillside, making a huge noise, frightening these grouse, who would then fly at high speeds towards what we call butts, or little shelters where the shooters would be located. And I'm not a shooter, but if you are a shooter, this is one of the most exciting sports in the world, and it's only something you can experience basically in Scotland, driven grouse shooting. Now, driven grouse shooting was not really a big environmental problem as such. What it was a problem, however, was in the extent to which they killed anything that predated on grouse and grouse chicks. So we basically eliminated the wildcat. We think there's probably 35 animals in Scotland. We eliminated the sea eagle. We drove the golden eagle to the verge of extinction. We drove capercaillie to extinction. We drove a lot of animals to extinction to create this bit of a desert, a heather desert, where grouse could multiply in great numbers and be shot during the shooting season in August. And in the last 20 or 30 years, you've had more money coming into this. You've had more intensive methods of grouse management. You've had medication, medicated grit that the animals consume as part of their necessary digestion of heather, which requires literally grit to break it down. That's been medicated. You've had more sophisticated methods of eradicating predators. You've had intensive constructions of roads in the hills. You've had a much more intensive management. And that's come under a lot of criticism because of the aesthetics of it, but also because of the impact on raptor persecution, which has grown in the last 30 years quite extensively. So there's a debate around, well, the government is going to regulate driven grouse shooting and license it. So if you want to conduct a driven grouse shoot, you will need to have a license. If you breach any of the terms of that license, which will include things like evidence of breaking the law in relationship to protected species, you will lose that license. Now, whether driven grouse shooting has a future is actually arguable. It's a victim of climate change too. Grouse are their populations fluctuate very wildly. Very, very difficult to get consistently high numbers of grouse to shoot every year. Typically, you're going to get 2 or 3 years of very, very low numbers. And it's maybe not even a sustainable land use in the long term. I think what's going to be more sustainable is accepting that grouse have been here forever. Red grouse are a native Scottish animal. They did not require bare Scottish heather moorlands to live in the past. What they lived on was the upper verges of the forest, the open land, the scrub land, and they'll continue to exist in that. And there are other forms of hunting that can be conducted, like the walked up hunting in continental Europe, which it may well be the future for red grouse in Scotland. I doubt there have been celebrated driven grouse shoots that have known and experienced high numbers of grouse on a regular basis. They're gone. They don't exist anymore. So it's a land use that is on its way out for a whole variety of factors.
Yeah, you brought up raptor persecution on heavily managed grouse moors. We've been into several grouse moors, and I'll tell you, Andy, I mean, as soon as we get up there, I mean, in a matter of minutes, if not 10 or 15 minutes, we're seeing a large number of raptors and a large number of species of raptors, from golden eagles. We're seeing buzzards, we're seeing hawks, we're seeing falcons. I mean, it's the way it is, but and I know there's laws against raptor persecution in this country, just like it is in the United States. I mean, in the United States, it's a federal offense. You go to prison. It's not. It's taken very seriously. But you've mentioned that that there is this ongoing issue of raptor persecution associated with grouse moors and gamekeepers. And what I'm really trying to kind of get my head around, it doesn't quite jive with what I've seen in some of these estates. Is it just the issue is that we've got a few bad actors, or is this pretty universal as far as raptor persecution? It's pretty universal across the board with all sporting estates?
We don't know, because raptor persecution is a crime that can be conducted. The evidence can be concealed, there are no witnesses, and prosecutions are very rare. So to be perfectly honest, we don't know. But what we have from evidence of satellite tagging, so scientists have attached small satellite tags on young eagles. I attached one myself to a young eagle, which then disappeared in suspicious circumstances within 6 months. What we know from a major study published 5 years ago on satellite tagged eagles was that applying an analysis of the fate of these eagles, you'd expect some of them to die. That's natural. And so the pattern of death should be relatively random, but it wasn't. So with a very, very high statistical probability, these birds were disappearing. That's all they were doing. They were disappearing at far, far higher intensities on areas used for driven grouse moors. And that is all proven by data. And the probability that that was down to natural causes is extremely low. So the probability is that they disappeared because they were persecuted. They can also disappear because their satellite tag malfunctions, but again, you'd expect to experience a random array of satellite tag malfunction because these birds could be anywhere. I mean, golden eagles don't necessarily go to grouse moors. They go all over the place. They've got quite a wide palette of things to predate. But there were these black holes appearing in grouse moor areas, and all the data is there in a very well regarded scientific analysis that was done. And that proves, and I would go so far as to say that proves, that raptor persecution is still happening on driven grouse moors. Now, if you go to those driven grouse moors or those areas of driven grouse moors, you will see eagles, you will see kites, of course you will. They're not eradicated, okay? And one of the things that happens, if you're in an area where there is raptor persecution happening, and these raptors are being killed, then that is a territory that has been vacated. What you'd naturally expect to see if you visited that area actually is quite a lot of eagles competing for that empty territory. So the presence of these eagles is no evidence whatsoever to contradict the well-established scientific evidence that the disappearance of eagles is highly correlated with driven grouse moors. So what that tells us is that raptor persecution is still happening, and it's happening in and around grouse moors. Now, it's not happening in and around every grouse moor, but it so happens that grouse moors, because of the particular characteristics, it has to be relatively dry, extensive heather. These are found in discrete parts of the country. There's maybe 4 or 5 main areas where they happen. So these birds, golden eagles, are disappearing in those areas. That does not mean to say that every single grouse moor manager in that area is killing eagles. Yeah. It means that some are. Maybe just one. Maybe half. We don't know. Okay? But they are disappearing. They are being persecuted. And that is happening in order to facilitate the intensification of driven grouse shooting. And I would emphasize the intensification because you find a lot of traditional grouse moor managers are not managing intensive shoots. They're not putting out medicated grit. They're not giving a license to their gamekeepers to slaughter everything in sight. But some of them themselves are coming under pressure from their neighbors because this is a highly remunerative business. So yeah, that's the answer I would give.
You know, let's talk about sea eagles. We've done a lot of research, and it seems like the sea eagle population has really made a rebound in the western part of Scotland, all along the Highlands and Islands there. We're also hearing that there's some issues there that are more related to, maybe crofters, where maybe the persecution that may happen out there might have something to do with them trying to protect their lambs and sheep. Really, how do we address this? I mean, how do we figure out, really what's going on here?
Well, sea eagles were driven to extinction by hunting estates in Scotland. They killed sea eagles, like they killed a lot of other wild animals. They are a successful reintroduction of our largest avian predator. They live mainly on the west coast of Scotland. Their reintroduction has been extremely successful. But as you'd expect with an apex predator, if they can see something that's easy to kill and eat, as opposed to something that has a low chance of success, they'll go and eat the easy prey. So there's no doubt that farmers are losing lambs to sea eagles. That's not in any question. The extent to which that's happening, how many, what the impact of that is more contentious. Because again, rather like raptor persecution, this is not a crime. The sea eagle's not committing a crime by predating on a lamb. But just because of the nature of the environment, it's not often an activity that is observed. The lamb often disappears and there's no evidence that the lamb has been predated. Sometimes there is evidence, and then the question is, well, what predated it? Was it a sea eagle? Was it a fox? Again, sometimes that can be clear, sometimes it's not. So, I mean, this is an example where you have conflict. Yes, you do. And historically, you've had conflict between people enthusiastic to reintroduce animals like sea eagles, on the one hand, and farmers and crofters who are critical and whose economic interests are harmed. I'm a firm believer that that can all be resolved. This is not an impossible riddle. How it can be resolved is a little bit more difficult. It involves people sitting down and agreeing how to manage the population of sea eagles. Perhaps, although that's incredibly difficult because it's a wild animal. More likely is manage lambing. I mean, in Scotland, for example, if you go to Norway, they lamb in byland, or even inside sheds, okay? A very cold climate. We have sheep ranching, so sheep are having their lambs on the open hill. Maybe we need to change the way we manage sheep. So for example, if we're going to have more trees, there's a strong argument for bringing domestic animals further down the hill, having them more in sight, managing the lambing season a little bit more intensively. I mean, if they're lambing in the vicinity of the farmhouse, sea eagles are not going to predate them. So there's all sorts of ways in which this can be changed, it can be managed. It would be desirable to have better evidence as to exactly how much predation is happening and when and where and what the causes are. Some of this may, for example, and I'm speculating here, to do with the fact that some traditional fishing grounds for sea eagles, they're not getting the fish they were historically getting, so they're going for lambs instead. Okay, let's address why the fish stocks are not there for them, if that is one of the causes. So we need more investigation.
You know, that's a great answer, Andy. We spoke earlier before that we were recording here about rewilding, and one of the things I'm really trying to get my head around is really kind of what this idea or this concept of rewilding truly is. We've since we've been here, we've heard about bringing back beavers and other small mammals that were once here on the landscape, and that sounds great. But we also hear people talking about bringing back large predators, wolves, bears, lynx, and so you're dealing with a land that is really all about the economics here is agriculture and literally 8 million sheep that are on the landscape here. Plus you have people that are all over the place. I mean, it's not like you get big wilderness areas here. Kind of really, what is the outcome of rewilding, and how do all these animals fit into that equation?
Well, I haven't studied this, but my impression is that some of the early advocates of rewilding, which is a constructed term, I don't know the history of that term, how long it's been around, but my impression is it's a relatively recent term. But some of the early advocates were advocates of of the reintroduction of large predators. It was a code for let's have the wolf back, let's have the bear back, let's have the lynx back. And they were enthusiastic individuals, often with quite an ability to communicate their passion for seeing these animals back in the wild. But there were a relatively small number of people. And then rewilding became a broader thing, which was, I don't like the term. I would prefer we talk about ecological restoration or nature restoration or even peatland recovery, woodland restoration, river health, marshlands and wetlands. I mean, that's what I want to see. I want to see our wetlands, our peatlands, our forests, our rivers restored to ecological health, right? And I don't think anyone would broadly argue with that. But if you choose to label it rewilding, okay, you immediately enter a whole series of debates like, was this land wild in the first place? Because you're implying it was. right? And excuse me, my ancestors lived here. You know, this is a degraded environmentally habitat. I get you, I agree, that's not in dispute. But it's also a depopulated environment. Are you actually saying we should all live in a nature reserve? So those were the kind of responses to that. And in my view, it set up a fairly unhelpful and unproductive debate, which needn't have been that unproductive debate. So the term itself is not helpful. Some of the early adopters of that term were doing it for reasons which people still today find difficult, the reintroduction of large predators like wolf and bear. And some of the more modern advocates of it are people who are coming in, buying a lot of land and restoring forests. And I welcome that investment in our natural environment. But these people often tend to be very wealthy. They often tend to be from outside, not just outside the local area, but outside of Scotland, sometimes even outside the UK. And they immediately bring with them the baggage associated with the whole debate around land ownership, because they're buying large areas of land to rewild. So again, that makes this debate complicated, because people who don't want foreigners or wealthy people or people buying large areas of land find themselves critical of an endeavour which, in other terms, were it to be done by other people maybe, if it were to be done by themselves maybe, would be regarded as quite positive. So I think the problem with rewilding is, to put it in a nutshell, it embraces a lot of concepts which are problematic and come into conflict with each other, and are politically contentious. My view is it doesn't need to be like that. And we have made a little bit of a rod for our own back by using the terms we've been doing, and by approaching it the way we've been approaching it.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. Let's change gears here a little bit. Carbon sequestration. You know, we're seeing and hearing about these schemes by businesses, major corporations, multinational corporations that are buying up these sporting estates. Obviously, it's not very fertile ground compared to farmland down below, but kind of really this carbon sequestration scheme, you know, how is that really going to affect the land? And what really is the end game in this carbon scheme, you know, sequestration program?
Well, this is a relatively recent phenomena. The whole concept of net zero is something I find deeply problematic, in fact. Net zero at what net? You know, if you have high levels of emissions and high levels of sequestration, that's net zero. You can also have low levels of emissions and low levels of sequestration, that's net zero. Net zero is defined in terms of a temperature goal. Okay, so it's defined as removing greenhouse gases to the point where we stabilise warming at the current ambition is 1.5 degrees. Now, historically, of course, the planet has emitted carbon and sequestered carbon. And since industrialisation, of course, we've been on a pathway where we've been emitting far more than we're sequestering. And that has to be addressed and ultimately reversed. Net zero has been embraced, I think, by some policymakers in government, and certainly by a lot of people in business, as an attractive goal, because it fudges the fundamental challenge, which is to reduce emissions. Now, reducing emissions is hard work. It comes at some cost. It also means that some industries are going to have to close down in their current format. Doesn't mean to say we're not going to have cement in the future, but we're going to do it differently. And so there's been this growth in this view that if you invest in projects which are sequestering carbon, you can count that against your own targets for net zero. Now, I find that deeply problematic in the sense that the UN has itself said, and it was agreed in Glasgow at COP26, that carbon offsetting, as it's called, the ability to say I'm trapping this amount of carbon here so I can continue to emit here, should only be used as a last resort when you have exhausted all possible practical means of reducing emissions. And I have no problem in that context. The problem is we don't have a governance framework that says to the people who want to buy these credits, have you actually gone that last mile to reduce your emissions? And unless you have, you don't get to buy carbon credits. But the bottom line is this is a Wild West market, because people who own forests or woodlands and wetlands and peatlands, or who can buy them, see an emerging market in carbon credits, which are tradable to companies who want to buy them so that their bottom line in terms of carbon looks better. So the first thing to say is this is a completely unregulated business. There are government-backed codes which audit claims about carbon sequestration, and that's useful, but they just audit the claims, they don't audit the market. And I think what's happening in Scotland just now, it's been demonstrated in studies done recently, is that the interest from pension funds, from investors, is driving up land values, because immediately you introduce a new market that attributes value to land and what it can produce, then the capital value will rise. The capital value of Scottish land is already at historic highs because it's a very open market. Anyone from anywhere in the world can come and buy it. Britain's regarded as a safe haven. It's a modern democracy. It's a safe place for your money. It's why all the Russian oligarchs came here, spent all their money here, sent their kids to school here. Okay, so we've already got an inflated land market. This is inflating even further on the back of a speculative endeavour, which is these carbon credits will be real things that have an increasing value. I don't think they will do. I think there's big questions to be asked about that. But the bottom line is that a ton of carbon sequestered through the restoration of wetlands or woodlands in Scotland, the carbon credits for which are bought by a corporation in France or the States to offset its emissions, is a ton of carbon that is not contributing to global cooling. It's contributing to a company not cutting its emissions. That's all it's doing. So I think we should make it illegal to sell carbon credits. I just don't see the point of it. The one argument for it is encouraging investment, so that people are investing in so-called natural capital, which otherwise they wouldn't do if it weren't for the carbon credits. And I can see that argument. It's not a good enough argument in my book. We should be restoring these ecosystems because it's a good thing to do, because it sequesters carbon, because it helps cool the planet. And we shouldn't be getting messed up in offsetting schemes. Unless, as I say, at the very margins, where it might be necessary, where targets are not being met, you've got critical areas of the economy that need to offset emissions. But until we're at that point, I just don't think we should be bothering with it, frankly.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer, Andy. Still sticking to carbon sequestration, I've been up on Kinrara, which I understand a beer company, I think BrewDog, has purchased it, and they're in the process of rewilding it for carbon sequestration credits. I'm really trying to understand, at least with the sporting estate model, there is a number of people that are hired, the gamekeeper, the assistant keeper, people that are on staff. But when you do this rewilding in regards to forestry tracks, things along those lines, there really isn't a lot of people working up there once the trees are planted and until they're cut down. What really is the outcome when you start removing these people from the land and these small communities where, they're a big part, sporting estates are a big part of things?
Well, I mean, the Highlands has got a history of people being removed from the land. The clearances were the most dramatic example of that. The coming of sheep ranching removed people. The coming of the sporting estate removed people. The coming of industrial forestry removed people. So all these new land uses that have come about at scale and over a relatively short period of time have of necessity got rid of the people who were associated with the previous land use. They have in time, of course, balanced that out by the people that come with the new land use. Now, I haven't done the sums on any of this historically, but all I'm saying is it is just a basic fact that if you're going to change a land use, then there's going to be people that lose their livelihoods associated with the previous one. And there'll be people associated with the new one, maybe not immediately, but in time, and maybe not there, but maybe elsewhere in the economy. So we are seeing change. I think the real challenge, and you talk about gamekeepers, I think the real challenge and the ethical thing to do is to keep people and say, we've got new jobs for you. Now, if they don't want the new job, that's fine. They can move and get another job, their existing job elsewhere. But if they want the new job, you give them training and new skills. So, for example, gamekeepers who are traditionally employed to manage extensive areas of land for deer and grouse and have developed very sophisticated skills in doing that, if those skills are no longer required, these people are still at heart wildlife managers. Okay? Wildlife will still need to be managed in Brewdog's forest. Okay? So the challenge is to encourage and persuade these people to reskill, possibly to adopt roles that are more multifaceted. So as well as retraining as wildlife managers in new contexts, they can also develop skills as rangers, as wildlife guides, tourism, etc. And that actually is good for them because they're no longer reliant on a single job and a single employer. They have a range of skills addressing a range of economic opportunities. So I don't see the criticism that I have many criticisms of companies like Brewdog buying land for carbon and stuff, got many, many criticisms of them. The one criticism I don't have of them is that by virtue of creating new land use, there's going to have to be changes in employment. That's just a fact of life. As I say, I think the challenge is, and the appropriate thing to do, is to take people with you. And I don't think there's any case whatsoever for sacking people just because they don't, you're no longer using the land for that purpose. I think you do actually have an obligation under the law to keep these people on. There are transfer of employment undertakings. But I think you have a broader duty to reskill and retrain. And I mean, we see that right across the economy. I mean, this is not new. I mean, Scotland used to build, a third of the world's shipping. We don't build ships anymore, right? People are not going to be drilling for oil in the North Sea. They're not drilling for oil in the North Sea now to the extent they were 20 years ago. What are we doing? We're reskilling, we're retraining, we're redeploying. Many of the people working in the North Sea oil industry are now working in the offshore renewables energy. Broadly the same skills. They work offshore, they're engineers, they're technicians, they're lab people, they're marine people. So that's what we should do. I don't see that as a criticism of new land use. I just see it as a necessary fact of life when new land use comes along. But in my view, historically, there's always been more opportunities with the future than there have been with the past.
Yeah, that's another great answer. I'm really trying to, one of the things that's been really beaten into my head by wildlife biologists, scientists, is that everything in nature, every living thing in nature is programmed to overpopulate the carrying capacity of the land. Whether it be deer or elk or in North America or elephants, say in Botswana, where, they've got a population of over 140,000, some government officials say 200,000, yet the carrying capacity for the land is only 40,000. And when you have that many elephants on the land, what we're seeing firsthand is the destruction of habitat, that ecosystem that not only is what the elephant needs to survive, but all these other animals that live within that, in those same habitats. So trying to figure out here, there's so much angst towards sporting estates and gamekeepers. Really, if the government chooses to, socially has the votes are there to ban the shooting, the sporting estate model, who really is going to manage those wildlife populations? As we know, deer are going to continue to grow. Whether or not red grouse populations expand, it's hard to say without the management out there, the enhancement of the lands. But, if the sporting estate model is gone tomorrow, who is going to manage those lands in the best interest of wildlife?
Well, I don't think government is going to ban hunting. There's no substantial public support for banning all hunting. Okay? And the reason for that is that lots and lots of people like to go fishing. Fishing is hunting. Yeah? So if, for example, wild fishers, anglers, perceive that government wants to ban hunting, the first thing they think about is, well, we're next. So there's sufficient numbers of people in the population who enjoy pastimes like angling, who would be unsympathetic to any blanket ban on killing animals for fun, for example, right? So I don't think it's going to happen. But what is happening is that the methods deployed to kill animals, for example, in fox hunting, are being tightened and tightened and tightened. Some of that might be overreach, some of it isn't, but it is being tightened. So what we're going to see is more licensing and more regulation, I think, of hunting, particularly those hunting opportunities where there are perceived threats to species and ecosystems, or adverse impacts like intensive driven grouse shooting, which is associated with raptor persecution. So that's how I see things panning out. So in 50 years' time, we're still going to hopefully be hunting animals, catching fish. I mean, I'm vegetarian, I don't do that myself, but I'm perfectly content that other people do. How is it going to be managed? Well, it will be managed by those who have the responsibility to manage it. Who are those people? Well, at the moment, they are the people, by and large, who own the land. In 50 years' time, it'll still be, by and large, the people who own the land, but the responsibility, I think, of managing wildlife populations will be more of a shared responsibility between the owners of the hunting rights and public agencies, both local government and wildlife agencies. We don't even have a wildlife game and wildlife service here to regulate it. It's very, very ad hoc. So in 50 years' time, I see it being a more regulated environment, a licensed activity, an activity that's open to many, many more people. I mean, I'd like you to be able to go down to your local post office and buy a license to go deer hunting. Why should people not be able to have access to a £100 license to go and shoot red deer? The reason they can't do it at the moment, I mean, they can in some cases, don't get me wrong, but the reason by and large people can't do that as a popular activity in the same way they can do angling as a popular activity is the activity is controlled by a tiny number of people who by and large want to do it themselves or for their friends or people who are willing to pay large sums of money, not modest sums of money. So I see the opportunities of democratizing hunting as a way of bringing new revenue and new public support into the need to manage wildlife populations by culling, by killing, by hunting. And that's where the money will come from. And we're talking about wildlife populations which in and of themselves will have much less of a negative impact on the wider environment. So they don't have the same level of externalities as red deer and sheep and things do, at salmon farming in the seas do at the moment. We'll have eliminated, hopefully, these externalities. So they're not costs that need to be borne by other people. For example, foresters currently bear the costs of high numbers of red deer that they're not responsible for, but they have to put up the fences. So, yeah, it's always an issue about who pays for things. But I think in a restored ecosystem, you will have many, many more opportunities for economic activity, broadly speaking, many more activities. We're seeing, I mean, tourism is one of Scotland's biggest industries. We're seeing here in Habber in the Highlands, Fort William is branded the outdoor capital of the UK, because in the last 20 years, people are flocking here to climb mountains, to canoe, to mountain bike. This is the future. People want to get into the countryside and they want to do all sorts of things in the countryside, from sitting and contemplating nature and bird watching to shooting deer. And if we can accommodate large numbers of people doing that in a regulated environment, that will bring huge new economic opportunities, I think, to lots of people, right across the Highlands.
Hey, Tony, do you have a question?
I can talk about this all day long, but this has been.
Well, you've had enough. That's been a long time.
No, this has been great.
Yeah, because
I mean, You have all these competing
Yeah, yeah.
sides. But for me, I want to leave this planet better than we found it. I mean, we're hearing about all these different opinions. These people, that don't like these other people, and it's just one opinion after another. But even in North America, in the hunting community, we have some hunters that don't like other hunters because they hunt behind a fence that's more than 3.5 feet tall, or maybe they use modern archery tackle, or use a dog while they go hunting. It's just crazy. We've been hunting as long as humans have walked on 2 feet. And, with the huge human population we have on this planet now, I mean, somebody has to be a good steward of the land. I mean, we have that responsibility as a species. Mm-hmm. We really need to be a better neighbor with all the other animals around here. I mean, when we came here, it was pretty evident this is nothing but class warfare.
Well, it is. I mean, in comparison to countries like the United States, which are, colonial projects, people went there, wiped out the indigenous populations, imposed upon it an order of some description, and therefore sort of norms and rules, not from a blank sheet of paper, but from their own cultures and heritages, mainly European. A lot of people emigrating to the New World were escaping the impacts of class warfare. I wouldn't call it class warfare. I mean, they were people who were economic migrants. They had no security in this country. They were being cleared and shipped off by wealthy people. And they found the New World as a place where they could start afresh. And I think that has influenced the kind of culture one finds in the New World, where one has kind of conflicts, yes, but almost not a clean set of rules, but something that is more discernible by looking at it and studying it for a relatively short period of time. Say, okay, that's how that works. Looking at these issues here in the UK, a country that has never had a revolutionary moment, we've never been colonized by somebody else and overrun and had their rules written over us. We've never had a revolution like the French did, in which they basically dismantled much of the privilege and wealth and feudalism that had dominated France for hundreds of years, and they basically got rid of it quite quickly. We've never had that. So we're living with a legacy here in the UK of a complex past, a system of feudal tenure that only got abolished by law in November 2004. A class system, we still, and up until 1999, the House of Lords still had hereditary peers, our second chamber, people who are only there because they owned land and are the descendants of people who owned land. No more qualification for being legislators than that. Much of our legal code is still the product of the 18th and 19th century, when the laws were made by male landowners, because you had to be male to get into Parliament and you had to own property. So what's that done for women, for example? So we are dealing, and at the root of a lot of this is the legacy of social forces that we haven't actually yet properly reformed, because we are an unreformed country, if you like. We're doing this slowly, but the influence of class, of inequality, of history, of wealth, of the historical patterns of ownership of land, these all have a bearing on what we see today. And they're all part of the debate, or at least they underpin the debate about what we should do with nature in a way that in other countries they are not. So they add, I would say, quite an interesting additional dimension to our debates about how to use land. But nevertheless, it's not a simple debate. There are people with a range of interests here, not just environmentalists and hunters and farmers, but people who believe that they have more of a say in what happens to the land than other people by virtue of the fact their families owned it for 1,000 years. Now, maybe that's true. You had people in the 19th century who resisted the Reform Acts because they said only the people that own the country should run it. And there's a certain elegant logic to that. your family owns your home. But you run it yourselves. You decide when to have breakfast and what to have for tea and how you're going to decorate the home. And you have conflict and disagreements, but you resolve it. But you don't expect anyone else to have a say. So, in a sense, if you as a collective of 10,000 male landowners own the country, there's a certain elegant logic to say you should run it. That argument was defeated comprehensively in the 19th century as the franchise was extended, and then as women got the vote. But we're still living with the legacy of that. So, for example, women are disenfranchised from land ownership because children don't have a legal right to inherit land. So we only abolished primogeniture in 1964. So culturally, land still gets handed down to the eldest son as a powerful cultural force from our past. Women, they don't get a look in. That's not universal, of course, but because they have no right, it means we've got a very skewed distribution of land just on a gendered analysis.
Yeah, Andy, I mean, this has really been a great treat to be able to sit down here and talk to you. And I hope we haven't been too much of a pain in the butt, but thank you very much.
Oh, no, it's really interesting.
I hope you enjoyed talking about it with us.
Yeah, no, it is enjoyable speaking to people who are just a little bit of a distance. Yeah. Because if I sit down with people from around here, underlying it all is like, well, where are you coming from? I might not know where they're coming from, or I might know, it doesn't really matter, but the point is they are coming from somewhere. Yeah. Whereas if you're a little bit distanced from it, you can just be pretty wide and open. Yeah. I find it really helpful, actually, because, I mean, I don't think about these things daily.
Yeah, well, I end up thinking about this every day. It's... Andy, again, just thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been very enlightening being able to understand just another perspective on the land use issues and management of wildlife and habitat here in Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands. And folks, thanks again for listening to this podcast. This is a production of the Shepherds of Wildlife Society, and we're trying to educate the broader public about the importance of wildlife and habitat management. Our modern conservation model, wildlife has to provide for the people that take care of it, and so this is part of a long series of podcasts where we're able to talk to all kinds of great people that are really invested in the issue. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen to us, and Andy, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.